The title of as-Siddiq given to Abu Bakr is not just a simple nickname that history recorded, it is a profound testimony to the very essence of who he was as a believer and a companion. When you look at that word, as-Siddiq, it means the one who affirms the truth without hesitation, the one whose heart submits instantly when others are still processing, and the one whose loyalty to truth is so pure that doubt has no home in his chest. This title was not self-declared, nor was it something that people casually attached to his name. It was born out of one of the greatest moments in early Islam, the night of al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, when the Prophet was taken on a miraculous journey that defied the logic of the Quraysh. The people of Mecca mocked and ridiculed this event, using it as an opportunity to shake the faith of the believers. Yet, when the news reached Abu Bakr, his response was immediate: if he said it, then it is true. That sentence alone became a definition of faith, a principle of submission, and a reflection of trust in the Messenger of Allah. Abu Bakr did not ask for details, he did not request explanations of how the Prophet traveled beyond the heavens in a single night, he did not pause to measure the story against what the intellect could grasp. Instead, his heart was so attuned to truth that the only proof he needed was the tongue of the Prophet. If the Prophet said it, that was sufficient, because the man who had never lied in his entire life could not suddenly speak falsehood in the most important matter of all, revelation. This moment captures the spirit of as-Siddiq more than any other. It is a state of conviction where certainty eclipses confusion, and faith conquers the need for worldly evidence. But to truly appreciate the weight of this, we must place ourselves in that historical context. The Quraysh were united in their disbelief. They ridiculed the Muslims, they were hunting for cracks in the young community, and this miraculous story seemed like the perfect opportunity to cause doubt. Imagine the pressure on the companions who were still new in their faith, struggling with persecution and mockery every day. For them, this story sounded impossible. And then comes Abu Bakr, standing tall with words that would echo through the centuries: if he said it, then it is true. He gave the community strength not just by affirming his own belief, but by becoming a fortress of certainty for others. His conviction steadied the trembling faith of many, and in that moment, he embodied the role of protector not with a sword but with his words, his heart, and his trust in Allah's messenger. The title as-Siddiq also reveals a deeper truth about Abu Bakr's character. Faith for him was not a negotiation between intellect and revelation, it was an immediate alignment of his heart with divine truth. That is why, when the Prophet invited him to Islam in the very earliest days, he accepted without hesitation, without demanding miracles or proofs. It was as though his soul had been waiting for this call, and the moment it came, he recognized it. To him, truth was self-evident when spoken by the Prophet. This readiness to affirm truth without delay became a defining feature of his life. This unwavering affirmation was not blind following, it was rooted in years of knowing the character of the Prophet, in years of witnessing his honesty, his compassion, his truthfulness. Abu Bakr was a man of intelligence, a man respected in Quraysh, a man of experience in trade and leadership. Yet, when it came to revelation, he recognized that ultimate truth transcends human logic. His intellect bowed to faith, not because it was irrational, but because it recognized that the source of truth was higher than human reasoning. This is why the title as-Siddiq is so unique. It represents a merging of intellect, heart, and faith into complete submission. Throughout his life, Abu Bakr would carry this same spirit of affirmation into every test he faced. Whether it was standing firm when the Prophet passed away and the community was on the verge of collapse, or when false prophets arose and tribes threatened to abandon Islam, his first instinct was always to affirm truth and reject doubt. As-Siddiq was not just about one event, it was a lifelong posture of his soul. He lived it, breathed it, and became the embodiment of it. When we speak of Abu Bakr, it is easy to highlight the moments of leadership, the public decisions, the speeches, and the visible contributions. Yet one of the most striking dimensions of his life is the silent sacrifices he made, sacrifices that were often hidden from the eyes of people, sacrifices that did not demand attention or recognition, but whose impact preserved the very foundation of Islam. Abu Bakr was not someone who sought praise or wanted his name to be remembered for generosity. He gave, and he gave quietly. He stood behind the Prophet, supporting him in ways that others did not always see, and in doing so he embodied a lesson for all of us, that the strength of a person's faith is not in how loudly they announce their deeds, but in how consistently they carry them out when no one is looking. One of the clearest examples of this silent sacrifice is his use of wealth. Abu Bakr was a successful merchant, a man of means in Mecca, yet he saw his wealth as a tool for the sake of Allah. Rather than clinging to it, he spent it generously to protect the vulnerable, to strengthen the believers, and to aid the Prophet. When Muslims were being tortured in the early days of Islam, it was Abu Bakr who quietly went and purchased their freedom. Bilal ibn Rabah, who was being dragged on the burning sands with rocks on his chest, found liberation because Abu Bakr spent his wealth to buy his freedom. And Bilal was not the only one. There were many slaves and oppressed people whom Abu Bakr rescued. These were not grand public gestures meant to show off his generosity. These were personal, often hidden sacrifices, done for the sake of Allah and His Messenger. It was this quiet giving that strengthened the ranks of Islam and gave hope to those who otherwise had no escape. We must reflect on the nature of these sacrifices. At a time when the Muslims were few, poor, and under constant persecution, every act of support carried immense weight. Abu Bakr could have easily protected his wealth, rationalizing that the risks were too high. He could have thought of his own family first, of his business, of his social standing in Quraysh. But instead, he placed the cause of Islam above his personal comfort. His silent contributions were the lifeline of the community. They created an environment where Islam could grow, where the weak were protected, and where the Prophet could carry on his mission with one less burden. His sacrifices were not limited to wealth. They extended to moments of personal danger and emotional hardship. When the Prophet was preparing to migrate from Mecca to Medina, Abu Bakr had already been preparing for months. He kept 2 camels ready, feeding and caring for them, waiting for the day when the Prophet would need him. When the time finally came, he did not hesitate. He walked beside the Prophet on that perilous journey, shielding him, worrying about him, offering himself as a barrier against any threat. In the cave of Thor, when the Prophet lay down to rest, Abu Bakr used his own garments to block the holes of the cave, even placing his foot in one of them so that nothing could harm the messenger. And when something stung him, causing him pain, he remained silent, unwilling to disturb the Prophet's sleep. These are not the actions of someone seeking recognition. These are the actions of a man who sacrificed quietly, purely out of love and loyalty. Even after becoming Caliph, Abu Bakr's sacrifices remained understated. He did not surround himself with luxury or elevate himself above the people. He would milk the goats for the widows of Medina until his final days, refusing to abandon a service he used to do before leadership was entrusted to him. This humility, this continuation of service, reveals the depth of his character. It shows that sacrifice for him was not a temporary act but a way of life. He did not view himself as someone above the community, he saw himself as part of it, willing to give of himself for its well-being. The lesson here is profound. Greatness is not always in the loud, visible acts. Sometimes it lies in the sacrifices made quietly, consistently, and with sincerity. Abu Bakr's silent sacrifices sustained Islam in its most fragile stages. His generosity, his protection, his emotional support for the Prophet, his willingness to endure hardship without complaint, all of these were threads woven into the fabric of the early Muslim community. Abu Bakr was a man whose strength did not manifest in the form of harshness, loud commands, or an intimidating presence. Rather, his strength was in his gentleness, in the calm steadiness of his heart, and in the ability to lead with compassion while never compromising on principle. This quality of gentle leadership is often overlooked, yet it was one of the most vital reasons the Muslim community was able to survive the turbulent years after the death of the Prophet. Leadership, after all, is not just about making decisions, it is about carrying the burdens of an entire community, about being a source of stability when everything else is shaking, and about instilling hope when despair seems inevitable. Abu Bakr's personality was soft, his heart tender, and his voice often choked with tears when he recited the Quran, yet that very gentleness became the backbone of his strength. The day the Prophet passed away was one of the darkest days in Islamic history. The companions were overcome with grief, some even denying that the Prophet had died, unable to accept such a reality. Umar, known for his strong personality, drew his sword and threatened anyone who dared to say that the Prophet had passed away. In that moment of confusion and emotional collapse, it was Abu Bakr who stepped forward, calm and firm, yet gentle in his words. He recited the verse, Muhammad is no more than a messenger, many were the messengers that passed away before him. If he dies or is slain, will you then turn back on your heels? This verse cut through the fog of grief and restored clarity to the companions. Notice the strength here, it was not in shouting louder than Umar, not in forceful displays of dominance, but in the calm recitation of Allah's words, delivered with conviction. His leadership lay in his ability to be composed when others were shaken, to be firm in faith when others were overwhelmed by emotion. This gentleness did not mean weakness. On the contrary, it was a different kind of strength, the strength to remain unshaken by fear of what people might say, the strength to prioritize truth over public opinion. When tribes across Arabia began to rebel after the death of the Prophet, refusing to pay zakat or claiming false prophethood, many companions, including Umar, advised Abu Bakr to be lenient, to give them time. Yet Abu Bakr, in his calm but resolute manner, declared that he would fight anyone who withheld even a rope used for tying a camel if it was due as zakat to the community. His words carried no anger, no harshness, only certainty and determination. This was a man who would not allow the foundations of Islam to be compromised, even if he had to stand alone. His gentle demeanor was matched with an iron resolve, and it was this combination that allowed him to unite the Muslims during such a fragile time. In personal interactions, his leadership style was marked by humility. He did not place himself above the people, he lived simply, wore simple clothing, and refused to draw from the treasury for anything beyond basic sustenance. He engaged with people not as a ruler towering over them but as a servant leader, someone who was accessible, approachable, and genuinely concerned for their welfare. This humility, paired with his compassion, earned him the trust and love of the community. People did not follow him out of fear, they followed him out of respect and out of recognition that his decisions were made sincerely for the sake of Allah. What made his leadership even more unique was that his tenderness of heart never weakened his ability to enforce justice. He was known to weep frequently when reciting Qur'an, his voice breaking from emotion in prayer, yet that same man could also command armies, appoint leaders, and make the hardest of decisions without faltering. His tears did not diminish his resolve, they elevated it, showing that leadership does not require suppressing one's humanity but rather channeling it to serve others. The strength of his gentle leadership lay in his balance, softness without weakness, firmness without cruelty, humility without insecurity, and authority without arrogance. Abu Bakr's relationship with wealth was unlike that of most people. For many, wealth is something to guard, something to accumulate and preserve, a source of status and comfort in this world. But for Abu Bakr, wealth was never an end, it was always a means. It was a tool in his hands, not a master over his heart. His generosity was not impulsive charity given in a moment of emotion, it was deliberate, strategic, and purposeful. He saw wealth as a responsibility entrusted to him by Allah, and he used it in ways that would strengthen the faith, support the Prophet, and secure the survival of Islam in its most vulnerable moments. His life demonstrates what it means to view money not through the lens of ownership, but through the lens of stewardship, recognizing that everything one possesses ultimately belongs to Allah and must be spent in His path. From the earliest days of Islam, Abu Bakr set an example that no one else could match. He used his wealth to free the oppressed, knowing that each life saved was a life that could flourish in worship of Allah. Bilal ibn Rabah is the most well-known example, but he was not the only one. Abu Bakr bought the freedom of several slaves who were being tortured simply for saying La ilaha illallah. He sought out those who were weak, those who had no tribe or protector, and he spent what he had to give them dignity and safety. This was not charity in the casual sense, it was a deliberate strengthening of the foundations of the Muslim community. By freeing these believers, he ensured that their faith could survive and that Islam would not be silenced through oppression. His generosity extended beyond individuals. When the Muslims were preparing for battles that would determine their very survival, Abu Bakr was at the forefront of giving. The most famous instance came during the campaign of Tabuk. The Prophet called upon the believers to contribute for the sake of Allah, as the Muslim army needed provisions, weapons, and supplies. Umar, inspired by the urgency of the call, brought half of his wealth, confident that he would surpass Abu Bakr that day. Yet Abu Bakr came with all of his wealth, every single coin, leaving nothing behind for his family except his trust in Allah and His Messenger. When asked what he had left for his family, his response was simple, I left them Allah and His Messenger. This moment captures the depth of his faith, the complete detachment from material possessions, and the recognition that true security does not come from wealth but from reliance on Allah. It is important to realize that such acts were not reckless, they were the highest form of trust. Abu Bakr was not a man ignorant of the needs of life, nor was he careless about his responsibilities. Rather, his giving came from an unshakable certainty that whatever is spent in the way of Allah will return in ways far greater. His wealth, instead of sitting in his home or circulating in the markets of Mecca, was transformed into an engine that drove the mission of Islam forward. Every freed slave, every provision bought for the Muslim army, every coin placed in the service of the Prophet was a seed planted for the hereafter. Even when he became Caliph, Abu Bakr continued to demonstrate this philosophy. He refused to take a salary at first, choosing instead to maintain his trade so that he would not burden the treasury. Only after the companions insisted did he accept a modest allowance, just enough to provide for his needs. He did not view leadership as a means of gaining wealth, rather, he saw it as an even greater responsibility to guard the resources of the Muslims and ensure they were spent where they were most needed. His personal life remained simple, his possessions few, and his generosity constant. Abu Bakr's use of wealth teaches us that money in itself is neither good nor evil, it is the way it is used that determines its value. For him, wealth was never hoarded, never displayed as a symbol of power. It was given away with open hands, strategically invested in people and causes that would uplift the ummah. He understood that wealth loses its value when it is clutched tightly but multiplies in worth when it is released for the sake of Allah. This was the mindset that made him unique, the mindset that transformed gold and silver into eternal reward, and the mindset that preserved the fragile community of Muslims when they needed it most. Style speech? Abu Bakr's life is marked by a striking consistency, a quality that makes him stand out among the companions of the Prophet. He was always the first to step forward when truth demanded courage, and always the last to step back when sacrifice was required. His faith was not seasonal, his loyalty was not selective, and his commitment was not dependent on ease or hardship. It was this unwavering steadiness that made him an anchor for the early Muslim community, someone who could be relied upon in moments of triumph as well as in times of trial. His story is not one of a man who appeared only when things were easy, it is the story of a companion who remained present through every phase of the Prophet's mission, from the earliest days of secret da'wah in Mecca to the most critical challenges of the Muslim ummah after the Prophet's death. When the Prophet first began calling people to Islam, it was Abu Bakr who immediately responded. There was no hesitation, no bargaining, no waiting to see how events would unfold. His heart recognized the truth instantly, and he became the first adult male to accept Islam without delay. From that moment on, he carried the banner of faith with courage. His consistency was such that wherever the Prophet was, Abu Bakr was not far behind. When others doubted, he affirmed. When others hesitated, he stepped forward. This pattern defined his entire life. One of the most powerful demonstrations of this quality was during the migration to Medina. The Prophet faced danger from every side, as the Quraysh plotted to assassinate him. To accompany him on that dangerous journey meant to risk one's own life, to walk into the unknown with enemies at every corner. Yet Abu Bakr did not wait to be asked, he had already prepared 2 camels, feeding and caring for them in anticipation that the Prophet might need them. His eagerness to be by the side of the messenger shows how he was always the first to act in service of Islam. And on that journey, his concern was not for his own safety but for the safety of the Prophet. As they walked, sometimes he would go ahead to guard against ambush, sometimes behind to watch their rear, sometimes to the side to shield him from danger. His body became a shield, his footsteps a barrier, his presence a comfort. This is what it means to be the first to step forward, not waiting for recognition, but instinctively placing oneself between truth and harm. After the Prophet passed away, the weight of leadership fell on Abu Bakr at a time when the ummah was on the verge of collapse. Many companions were paralyzed by grief, unable to imagine life without the Prophet. Others wavered in their faith, and tribes across Arabia began to rebel. It was Abu Bakr who stood firm, refusing to retreat, refusing to compromise the foundations of Islam. When others suggested leniency toward those who refused to pay zakat, he declared with certainty that he would not allow even the smallest obligation of Islam to be abandoned. His words were not driven by stubbornness but by clarity of principle. He knew that stepping back at such a critical moment would unravel the entire structure of Islam. So he stood his ground, alone if necessary, and his determination saved the ummah from disintegration. This consistency was also evident in his humility. Abu Bakr never sought position or power, yet when leadership was placed upon him, he did not shy away from it. He accepted the role of Caliph not out of ambition but out of responsibility, knowing that stepping back would create chaos. His first speech as Caliph captured this balance perfectly. He declared that he was not the best among them, yet he would lead as long as they obeyed Allah and His Messenger. His willingness to step forward in duty, despite personal reluctance, and his readiness to step back in humility when it came to praise, defined his leadership style. In every trial, whether it was the disbelief of Quraysh, the slander against the Prophet's family, the battles of Islam, or the turbulence after the Prophet's death, Abu Bakr was present. He did not pick and choose moments to be involved, he was consistent in his loyalty. His companionship was not conditional on ease, nor was his support tied to personal benefit. He remained steadfast when Islam was weak and unpopular, when Muslims were tortured, when the Prophet was ridiculed, and when the world turned against them. And he remained just as steadfast when Islam triumphed, when wealth and victories came, when the ummah grew in power. His soul was steady, unshaken by loss, uncorrupted by gain. When we think of Abu Bakr, we often remember him as the Caliph, the leader of the Muslims, the companion who stood by the Prophet at every turn, the man who defended Islam with his wealth and his resolve. Yet beneath all of these towering qualities lies another side, one that is sometimes forgotten, his humanity. Abu Bakr was not only a leader or a symbol of faith, he was also a father, a friend, and a man whose heart overflowed with tenderness. To understand him only as a figure of authority is to miss the depth of his character, because what made him truly remarkable was how he balanced greatness with humility, strength with vulnerability, and leadership with compassion. He was known to be a man of tears. Whenever he recited the Quran, his voice would falter, his eyes would fill, and his heart would tremble. Even before migration to Medina, when the Muslims prayed secretly in Mecca, Abu Bakr's weeping during prayer was so audible that the Quraysh became concerned that it might influence their women and children. His tenderness was not a weakness, it was the reflection of a heart deeply connected to Allah. In him, we see a man who could lead armies and govern a nation, yet who wept easily in remembrance of his Lord. This balance between strength and softness is a lesson in itself, showing that true leadership is not about suppressing emotion but about allowing it to refine the soul. In his role as a father, Abu Bakr's humanity shines even brighter. His daughter Asma risked her life to secretly deliver food to him and the Prophet during the migration, and his daughter Aisha became the beloved wife of the Prophet. Through these relationships, we see Abu Bakr not just as a companion but as a parent whose family was intertwined with the legacy of Islam. His trust in Allah was not just personal, he nurtured it in his children. He raised them with the same sense of sacrifice and devotion that he lived by. His willingness to risk his own daughter's safety for the protection of the Prophet during migration is evidence of how his private life was inseparable from his faith. He was also a friend in the truest sense. His companionship with the Prophet was not one of mere formality or distant loyalty, it was intimate, filled with love and sacrifice. In the cave during the migration, when Abu Bakr feared not for himself but for the Prophet, he whispered his concerns, and the Prophet comforted him with the words, "Do not grieve, for indeed Allah is with us." This exchange shows the human side of Abu Bakr, a man who felt fear, who worried, who hurt, yet whose heart always returned to reliance upon Allah. His closeness to the Prophet was not only about leadership or politics, it was about a deep bond of brotherhood and love that lasted until the final moments of the Prophet's life, when Abu Bakr was the one to lean over and kiss his forehead after his passing. Even in his position as Caliph, Abu Bakr never abandoned the simplicity of his character. He continued to serve the community in ways that most rulers would never consider. Before leadership was given to him, he would milk the goats for the widows and poor of Medina. After becoming Caliph, when he was reminded that this was no longer his responsibility, he insisted on continuing. He saw no contradiction between being the leader of the Muslims and serving them with his own hands. This is a level of humility that reveals his humanity more than any grand speech or decree ever could. His tenderness extended even to matters of justice. When his daughter Aisha was falsely accused in the incident of the slander, Abu Bakr was deeply wounded, not only by the pain caused to his family but also by the betrayal of those whom he had supported with his wealth. One of the accused was a man whom Abu Bakr had been financially assisting, and in his hurt, Abu Bakr considered withdrawing his support. Yet when Allah revealed the verse urging forgiveness and reminding believers not to withhold charity, Abu Bakr immediately resumed his aid. This was not the decision of a cold politician but of a man whose humanity guided him to place forgiveness over anger, mercy over bitterness. He was also human in his physical frailty. Unlike Umar, whose imposing stature commanded attention, Abu Bakr was slight, his body thin, his presence humble. He did not rule through physical dominance or fear, but through moral strength and spiritual conviction. His humanity was evident in his health as well, his body weakened toward the end of his life, reminding us that even the greatest of men are still human, still subject to the laws of mortality. Yet in that weakness, his spirit remained strong, and his leadership unshaken.